All right, it is noontime. We are so glad that you are with us today. Welcome. My name is Laura. I'm a law practice advisor with Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers, and welcome to Webinar for Busy Lawyers. This is our second one this week. We're so excited. It's Wellbeing Week in Law, and I am absolutely delighted to have my colleague here, Dr. Tracy Myers, to talk to us about mindfulness. As some of you may have heard, depending on when you entered, today's Zoom setup was done a little bit differently. So if you haven't already, please mute your Zoom so that way we can have Tracy present. If you have questions, please put them in the chat at the end and we will get to those after the presentation. To tell you a little bit about Webinars for Busy Lawyers, in case this is your first time joining us, this is something that Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers put on to give practical tips to attorneys and legal professionals in Massachusetts. If you don't know about us, we do confidential free services for legal professionals associated with Mass. And to introduce my colleague today, Dr. Tracy Myers joined LCL following her work for the state of Connecticut's Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. She spent 15 years working as a clinical neuropsychologist, was a director of behavioral intervention services for inpatient. She has a strong commitment to integrative medicine for mental health and wellness. She leads mindfulness and yoga programs for groups, individuals, and professionals in the workplace. She has a number of certifications in psychology as an advanced yoga teacher, yoga therapist, MS, MBSR, and others. She has authored several publications and articles, most recently Yin Yoga Therapy and Mental Health, an Integrated Approach, which is a book that she published with Singing Dragon. And Tracy, we're so glad that you can talk to us about mindfulness today. I turn it over for you for the presentation. And again, attendees, if you would just mute yourselves and have any questions in the chat, we will get to them following Tracy's talk. Tracy, take it away. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Laura. And thanks everyone for coming today. So this is sort of part two, and don't worry if you didn't come to part one of really looking at attention. So the first webinar we did about a month ago, we started to explore what is attention. We know sometimes that we struggle with paying attention, but what are some of the underpinnings around attention and what gets us stuck? And so today's presentation is really like part two. So what to do when we struggle with paying attention and giving ourselves some ways to use mindfulness to enhance our attention. So we'll be doing a few practices today. And we'll also be exploring the science behind why mindfulness can help strengthen our attention, which is like really fascinating to me that we can do practices that actually change how our brain works. So I'm going to share my screen now and we'll begin. All right. So as Laura already mentioned about our services at LCL, I'm one of the clinicians at LCL, so I do free and confidential consultations. Laura is one of our practice management specialists who helps attorneys and legal professionals with career and practice and technology challenges. All right, so we're going to be talking briefly about attention again, just to go over a little bit about the foundations. Understand what happens when our minds wander. Maybe your mind's already wandered, Laura's lovely cat, or your, a little distraction in the background. So we're going to talk about that today and how to work with the mind wandering. We're also going to have an honest discussion about stress, because stress is really one of the #1 ways that our attention can get impacted. And then look at how the powerful practices of mindfulness can help to enhance our attention. And then ultimately, we're going to talk today about some tools to start your own practice. So I always like to start with a very gentle, what we call a soft landing, which is a really brief meditation, just to start to come into the present moment. So like our character here, often when we try to sit and be quiet, we have lots of stimulation happening in our minds, and that's completely normal, okay? But let's start together with this little short practice. So I'm going to invite you to close your eyes or just lower your gaze. If you're looking at the screen, maybe looking away. And just noticing your feet on the floor. Perhaps relaxing the shoulders back and down so your body feels supported. I'm going to invite us to take a few breaths together. Maybe these breaths are a little fuller and deeper than your natural rate of breathing. So if you'd like to try breathing in through the nose, and then a gentle sigh as you breathe out. Let's do that again. We call this a letting go breath. Breathing in and gently breathing out. And then see if you can just gently find a natural rhythm of the breath. Maybe even noticing where you feel the breath. So maybe noticing the breath coming in and out of the nose. Or maybe you can feel your belly rising and falling. Sometimes I like to place my hand on my belly and just feel the belly as I breathe in, expand. And as I breathe out, belly relaxes. Just take a few moments just to settle into a natural rhythm of the breath, noticing in breath and out breath. Each breath is this fresh opportunity to come back to the present moment. So when your mind wanders, which it will, you can just gently return to the next breath. And then take a moment to notice how your body's feeling right now. So notice if there's any extra tension or any discomfort in the body, and see if you need to make any subtle or gentle movements to make your body feel more at ease. Maybe relaxing the hands, or maybe even a gentle massage. Sometimes if you notice an area of the body that feels a little tight, maybe gently rubbing, giving yourself some gentle healing touch. Just noticing, how's your body feeling right now? And maybe we can't change how our body's feeling, but we can just bring kind attention to what's here now in the physical body. And then gently noticing your stress level right now. Imagining on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being completely relaxed and 10 being so stressed you can't even sit still. Just check in. How stressed am I, or how relaxed am I? No judgment, just checking in to see where you are. We're doing this little invitation to meet ourselves just as we are. Appreciating whatever you have discovered in this soft landing. I'm going to invite you now, when you're ready, to gently come back to this present moment together. Maybe opening your eyes, maybe a little stretch, just letting yourself arrive back. So these little present moment or soft landings are a way to really help our brains to come back to what's happening right now. We'll talk about why that's important in a moment. So here's our soft landing. And one of the things I like to add in is this kind of kindness, this tone of, like notice what's here, and being gentle with ourselves rather than being, harsh on ourselves or judgmental. So that's one of the tenets of mindfulness, is this idea of being kind to yourself. So I'm going to do a little brief overview of our intention networks, because we'll go back to this in a few slides ahead when we think about how mindfulness can affect attention. So attention is actually not just one thing. There are different networks in the brain. And I'm going to talk about these 3 different functions or networks in the brain that make up our whole attention system. Our attention actually starts developing in infancy, right? And then it gets refined and enhanced all the way through adolescence, right? And so we're going to talk about the 3 main systems that help us to really allow our attention to work. And also what happens when maybe it's not working optimally. So there's 3 systems: orienting, alerting, and what we call cognitive control or executive functioning. So orienting is like our brain's flashlight. And its job when we're orienting is to narrow and really select what we're paying attention to, just like a flashlight, right? So this develops in infancy and fully developed by mid-childhood and allows us to have really good quality attention because just like a flashlight, it's like what we're shining on. And if we're trying to pay attention to multiple things, orienting doesn't help us, right? Like a flashlight, we can't kind of shine our light on multiple things at once. So orienting helps us to hone in on one thing. It could be externally in the environment around us or internally, like we just did with our breath. That was an orienting. We were really focusing on one thing. So if we move our flashlight around, we're task switching, right? So our flashlight goes from one thing to the other. And task switching is one of the challenges for many of us because when we switch tasks rapidly, like these flashlights over here, it requires us to engage our attention, then disengage, engage our attention, disengage. And over time, that can be exhausting, right? And so those of us, probably most of us, that are continuously switching back from a phone call, from our computers, from multiple things happening all at once, it can be very difficult because we're trying to orient our flashlight and it's moving really quickly. The second system I want to talk about is alerting. This is our vigilance system, and this develops in early infancy. Babies are alerting to noises, right? So you'll hear a baby cry if they're startled, right? That startle response, that's part of the alerting system. And it refers to receiving and maintaining a sensitivity to stimuli coming in. So it's really important, right? We want to be alert if we're walking like our gentleman up here. It helps us to get our attention. So noises, sometimes inner feelings like anxiety is an alerting system. When you feel that panicky feeling, our attention's immediately, gathering, like, what's wrong? What do I have to do, right? So alerting is a vigilant system and it helps with our survival, really important, and also can contribute to a lot of stress and anxiety. If we're alerting a lot and we're vigilant a lot, our nervous system's prepared for something to happen, right? So we'll talk about that as well. And finally, the executive attention. This is our highest level. This develops later, more toward adolescence and early adulthood. And we can often refer to this system as the juggler. We're trying to make sure all the things that we're paying attention to meet our goals. How many of us feel like our friend here, right? Trying to juggle all these different things. And we have the capacity to do this, but that doesn't mean that it's easy. And it does often take a toll the more we rely on this juggling. So executive attention is an effortful capacity to monitor our thoughts and feelings. If I do this, this happens. If I don't do this, this will happen. So it's relating to planning and problem solving. So it starts early, about 6 months, but it matures throughout childhood and then even into early adulthood. So these three systems work together to help us have a healthy attentional network. All right. So Laura helped me start to pause to recap because I love to have lots of information, but it's really good to just kind of pause and check in. So I thank Laura for making that suggestion. So again, we have three attentional networks that develop through early adulthood. Orienting is our flashlight, narrows our attention. Alerting helps get our attention. And executive attention is helping us to meet our goals. We're juggling multiple things. All three of those systems work together. So what happens though, and why do we struggle with attention if we've got these three systems all working together? And so we're going to talk a little bit about the challenges to our attentional networks. Now, think about mind wandering for a moment. That might even make your mind wander. But essentially, mind wandering is this process where we're doing something and suddenly our mind goes into something else, right? We might call it daydreaming or distracted thoughts, right? Typically, mind wandering is something where our minds are going ahead, thinking about what's going to happen next, or we're ruminating about something that happened before. It's not a bad thing. We naturally do it. But when our minds are wandering, we're more error prone, right? Because we're distracted. our overall attention span gets shorter. It takes longer to get back onto a task, and it's worsened by our increasing demands in technology. So what we find is when we're task switching, it can take longer and longer. So there's some research done recently about this task switching, and they found that for many of us, if we're paying attention to something and then we get distracted, let's say there's an email that comes in or a phone call, it can take about 23 minutes to get back to the original task, because each task leads us down another winding road. And by the time we get back to the task, a lot of time has gone by. And that can be really frustrating, right? So mind wandering and task switching back and forth can really impact how well we're able to pay attention. So what do we do about this mind wandering? So researchers out of Harvard in 2010 got really curious about mind wandering. They did a study where they had an app go off on people's iPhones throughout the day at random times. And it asked people a few questions. Number one, they asked, how are you feeling right now? Number two, what are you doing right now? And number three, are you thinking about something other than what you're doing? Is your mind wandering? And what they found was astonishing. They found that our minds wander about 47% of our waking life. Like half our life, our minds are wandering. So it is something that happens to all of us. But the part that was really interesting to me as a psychologist was the second part, which was how people felt. And these researchers discovered that people were less happy when their minds were wandering, even if they were thinking about positive things like a trip or something, that they were savoring from the past. So mind wandering can lead to feeling less content. There's something that happens in the brain when our minds are wandering, the systems of the brain that make us feel not as content as when we're focused in the present moment. So the good news is a wandering mind is an unhappy mind, but a present mind can help us feel happier. So this really, I think, starts to help us understand why mindfulness can be so helpful. One of the ways we can work with a wandering mind is to help us focus and gather our attention. And we need some skills to do that. That just doesn't happen automatically. We know this with kids, or if anyone has struggled with ADHD or attentional issues. If we just say, pay attention, that doesn't work, right? We need to train the mind so that we can learn how to work with a wandering mind. And that sounds simple. It's not, although the techniques are fairly basic, as we'll go over in a moment. So we have the mind wandering element that challenges our system. We have technology and the competing demands of the workplace. And then we have something called stress. Under high stress, our attention system gets strained. And I know I'm like saying something that's so obvious. And yet, understanding the attentional networks and understanding how stress impacts it can empower us to figure out how to work with stress so that our attention span can increase. So the more we understand about what is happening, the more we can build skills to inoculate or protect ourselves from the effects of stress. So this term VUCA is very popular right now. And it actually came out in the 1980s or 90s, the end of the Cold War. This idea of describing a world that's more volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. You can understand why this during the pandemic and the last several years, VUCA really kind of has taken hold as an understanding of why stress is so impactful for all of us. And if you think about your own life, even in the past 3 months, has there been a lot of VUCA? For most of us, yes, right? It might be in one area or it could be in multiple areas. So stress, particularly stress that has these components to it, can really impact our attention and our well-being, of course, too. So what happens to our attention span when we're stressed? So number one, our orienting system, our flashlight that we talked about, can get stuck. What happens for many of us is if our flashlight is stuck on negative thoughts or a negative situation, we can get really stuck there and we can get, in a way, hijacked. So our attention system isn't able to fluidly move from task to task. We can't shine our flashlight as we're going along. Our flashlight's just stuck on one area. And that often could be something's wrong, I'm going to get in trouble, I'm not good enough. It often relates to a negative thought about ourselves or someone else, right? Internal or external. So our orienting system can get stuck. Our alerting system begins to think about everything as a danger. Remember, our alert system is supposed to tell us if there's a dangerous situation. But what happens is if everything is perceived as dangerous, we can get hyper vigilant. We see this with people that have had trauma, right? People that have post-traumatic stress disorder or panic disorder. Even small things start to alert them. I was on an airplane the other day and I was flying with a friend of mine who gets really anxious when she flies. So, I watched her alerting system each time there was a noise or the seatbelt flashlight went on, seatbelt light went on. Her alerting system quickly went in. She looked at me like, "Is everything okay?" Right? And that's the alerting system that's starting to over focus. So that hypervigilance, which can happen. And finally, our juggler, our executive system, where we're always kind of juggling to make sure this works and this works. It starts to degrade when we're under stress. We start to drop balls. We're not able to because our alerting and orienting system have gone offline in a way. And so it's a lot harder to accomplish things. So all three systems, so sometimes it's just one part of the system that can get affected by stress, but for many of us, all three start to go offline and stop working as effectively, or they're almost too effective in the case of our alerting system. So much of our stress response relates to what we call subjective cognitive appraisal. And so let's say we have something that potentially could be stressful. An exam, if you were, taking an exam, think about the bar, meeting with your boss, a date, something financial. How we think about that situation, whether we think something bad's going to happen or it's no big deal, or it's even good, right? It's a positive stress. How we appraise it is going to create a response emotionally, physiologically, and behaviorally. So if we perceive a situation as I'm not going to be able to handle this, something bad might happen, we can imagine that all three of those responses are going to be more negative, right? So we might get anxious. Now our alerting system's up. We might get aroused physiologically, right? Our flashlight gets stuck. And our behavioral response, we might not be able to juggle, right? Because we're misinterpreting a situation. So you can see how attention and stress often relate to how we're thinking about a situation. I share this slide often when I'm teaching about mindfulness because it's really helpful to think about how when we can control our body's response and our thoughts, it helps us to almost inoculate ourselves from the daily stress that we all encounter. So we all have what we call this window of tolerance. And some of you may have heard me speak of this before or have come across it in other presentations. But the idea that, when we're functioning well, we're in our optimal state, our attention system's online, all three systems. We're able to reason well, so our juggler's working well, and our emotions are pretty well controlled. So it doesn't mean there's no stress, but it means we're able to manage stress effectively. But what happens for many of us, our arousal system, as we talked about earlier, can get overstimulated and we might get really distressed, right? Imagine a situation recently, maybe where you were running late or you were in an accident or something. Your body goes into what we often think about as a fight, flight, or freeze response. Now, if it's temporary, we go back to our window of tolerance and we can function well. But what we've seen for many of us is that if we have enough stress in our system and we stay vigilant, like my friend on the plane, the whole plane ride, we end up staying in that red zone. And the more we stay in that red zone, the harder it is to get back to our window of tolerance, right? For some of us, we can get very exhausted by continuing to stay in that red zone because we're in this overactive, vigilant state. So we might float back into this gray zone of feeling depressed, numb, just overstimulated to the point of shutting down, tired, right? So many of us are fluctuating back and forth between the red and the gray zone. And our attention suffers as a result, and our emotional well-being suffers. So when we're practicing mindfulness, we're going to be really working on how to bring ourselves back to the window of tolerance more effectively. We're not trying to get rid of stress. We're not pretending stress doesn't exist. But if we can get to our window of tolerance and keep it open wide enough, then we have more techniques than we can manage, and our attention span can function as it should, right? So with stress, the brain changes, and that is another really important thing to think about. This is why so many of us struggle, right? Because if we have chronic stress over time, our nervous system's in that vigilant state, and our brain doesn't work quite as effectively. Not just our attention span, but other parts of our brain. Our memory, for example, that's our long-term memory is stored in what's called the hippocampus, which is this little area here, right in the center, deep in the heart of the limbic system of the brain. And we don't think as well because our prefrontal cortex has shrunk, right? Atrophy means shrinking of brain or brain loss. Luckily, for most of us, this is temporary, right? But if we have enough stress, and we see this with people that have had PTSD or chronic early adverse childhood events, enough stress does change how our brain functions. So we want to protect our brains, right? We need our brains. We need them to help us function well. So as much as we can inoculate ourselves from stress, the better we're going to feel and the better we're going to think. So this just talks a little bit more about perceiving a stressful event and the releasing of hormones that go throughout our body, which can create a lot of stress in our system. Cortisol, which some of you are familiar with, can affect all of our systems, all of our different organs, and can make us more vulnerable to things like cardiac issues, right? For example. So when we're really activated in that red zone, we might have some of these experiences, which are very uncomfortable, right? It's a really distressing feeling when we're activated. So what happens over time is we end up practicing a stress network. We don't mean to practice it, but we start to practice both the feeling in our body, but also our behavioral responses. So we see this. You see people, for example, that have chronic anxiety or chronic anger because they've developed a system of coping, which often is coming from that red zone rather than our window of tolerance. And so over time, we start to have almost a quicker response with anger or with anxiety rather than being able to take our time to respond. Our reality gets filtered from our threat system. There's this expression called neurons that fire together, wire together, which essentially means that when we have a stress response, we start to learn how to respond. And if we don't have other skills to combat that, we tend to respond the same way. So we create different patterns in the brain that can be less helpful, right? So think about it in a less serious way. Something like when you're bored, you go on your phone, right? So you've created a pattern. And, if you look I was at the airport last week. So, but, at the airport, nobody, is looking at each other. Everyone's on their phone because we're waiting, right? So you wait and you're on your phone. So that's a pattern that's wired together. Boredom equals phone equals this neural network. On a positive note, we can use that same neurobiology to create new, healthier patterns using something like mindfulness. And we'll talk about that later. But we can use that same patterning to improve our functioning. I'll pause to recap. So mind wandering is normal, but it can impact our attention. Stress, that VUCA, specifically can interfere with attention. When our window of tolerance is exceeded, we can go into a hyper or hypo-aroused state. And our brains change under stress. It can strengthen negative neural networks and weaken positive ones. Okay. So Rick Hansen, who has written some wonderful books, Hardwiring Happiness, he wrote another book called The Buddha's Brain. He's a neuropsychologist, and he really explores what happens in the mind when we're meditating or using practices like mindfulness. And he has this phrase I love: we can use the mind to change the brain, to change the mind for the better and to benefit ourselves and other beings. Essentially, what he's saying is that we can use practices, the intentional cultivation of mindfulness, to change the networks in our brain, help us mind wander less, to stay in our window of tolerance, to help us feel better, and that helps the people we interact with. When we are less reactive ourselves, we have more capacity to be with other people, to listen, to help other people. And that to me is part of the motivation of why it's really important to practice mindfulness. It helps our own attention span and our own coping skills, but also helps us to be a better citizen, to be a better lawyer, to be a better partner, mom, dad, right? So again, many of you know this, but I want to just go over it briefly. Mindfulness is paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, non-judgmentally. So we're in the present moment when we pay attention to something like our breath, our body sensations, even something like sounds, which we're going to talk about in a moment. Mindfulness, living in the here and now. So mindfulness meditation, so that describes what mindfulness meditation is a practice. We can do it anywhere from a minute, usually 5 minutes or so is our sort of base, and even to an hour or more. And I'm going to talk today about specific kinds of meditation. So there are many kinds, but there are two main categories I want to highlight today. One is called focused meditation. Our mind focuses on a single object, like the breath, which we already practiced today, or something called open focused meditation, where we allow whatever's happening in our awareness to come into the present moment. We're going to practice that one together. So you'll have a taste of both of these. So I like this idea of thinking about mindfulness is to the mind what aerobic activity is to the body. So this scientist, Richie Davidson, out of the University of Wisconsin in the early 2000s, really wanted to explore what happens to our brains when we meditate. So some of you may be familiar with the Dalai Lama. Of course, you're familiar with Dalai Lama, but some of the monk studies where they hooked up monks and the Dalai Lama to really look at how are their brains. These guys have been meditating for their whole lives for hours and hours and hours. And what he found were that longtime meditators have different brains than those of us who don't meditate. And in particular, they have the capacity to learn, remember, and integrate information more effectively, and also have this innate sense of compassion, which can be learned through meditation. So practicing meditation on a long-term basis can really change how our brains work. The good news is we don't have to be monks and we don't have to practice thousands of hours to get the benefit. What researchers like Richie Davidson and others found were that actually practicing regularly over time can help all of us. The effects may not be quite as robust, especially in the beginning, but we can get a benefit by practicing for as little as somewhere between 8 to 12 minutes on a regular basis can actually change what's happening in the brain. All right, so what about attention? This is where we really started today. So research shows that focused attention, that's when we focus on one thing, like the breath, can improve our executive attention. So that's the juggler. So look at this little MRI scanner here, PET scan here. You can see controls have certain parts of the brain lit up, and the meditators have certain parts. So this is the prefrontal cortex. The meditators have a lot more lit up prefrontal cortex. That's where we're juggling, right? And so you can see particularly on both sides of the prefrontal cortex, meditators had a lot of lights going on. That means their brains are really functioning well. The second part shows that open monitoring, that's that open awareness, which we'll practice, helps us to keep our attention longer so that we're not doing that task switching, moving back and forth so quickly. It helps us to focus for a longer period of time. Meditators also are associated with having more brain matter in general, which is good. We want our brains to be really robust. When our minds wander, our brains don't function quite as well because we get stuck in the same cycle. Our brains continue to get stuck in the same cycle over and over again, so we're not having new thoughts, right? We're kind of stuck in the same ones and we're not learning new information. So our brain doesn't develop and increase with its capacity. So mindfulness helps us to focus on the present moment. It helps us to monitor when our minds wander, and it helps us to return back to the breath to make sure that our goals are aligned. So mindfulness can help with all three systems, okay? This is just a brief slide. I know it has a lot going on, but it shows how when our minds are wandering, certain parts of the brain are lit up, right? And then when we notice that our minds are wandering, we can come back to the present moment, and that helps us light up another part of the brain. And then ultimately, you can see at the bottom, part of the brain can stay lit up that helps us maintain our focus, right? So the more our mind wanders, the more different circuits are being lit up, and the harder it is to stay paying attention for a longer period of time. I just think it's cool. You don't have to understand all of it, but just to know, wow, our brains are changing each time we're able to stay in the present moment. Okay, pause for recap. So paying attention in a particular way on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally. That's what mindfulness means. Focused meditation, when we focus on a single object like the breath, helps improve our juggling, our executive attention. Open focused meditation helps us to improve our sustained attention. And regular meditation practice helps decrease mind wandering, decrease the stress response, and activate the part of the brain that's associated with more positive emotions. All right, so we did a little bit of the mindfulness of breath already. So I want to move ahead to another meditation practice just so we make sure that we have time. So I'll just give you a brief summary of the mindfulness of breathing. Focused attention. We notice the breath in the present moment, and then we notice when our minds have drifted and we redirect ourselves back to the present moment. Okay, so that's a little bit about mindfulness of breathing. I want to talk a little bit. So these are a couple of other instructions about our mindfulness of breathing. But I want to spend a little bit of time on open focus meditation because some of you may not have done that before. So the idea is allowing different experiences to come into your awareness. It might be thoughts, feelings, sounds, for example. And we're going to practice this open focus meditation now. Okay. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen for a moment so you can allow yourselves to close your eyes or just keep a soft gaze, maybe away from the screen again, and just let yourself come into a comfortable seated position. We're just going to do a brief meditation. Maybe taking a few breaths again. So we'll focus our attention just for a moment, noticing the breath coming in and out of the body. Noticing each breath, perhaps sensing how the chest rises on the inhale and falls away on the exhale. Observing the breath. So at first we'll use our breath to anchor to the present moment. So if your mind wanders, just come back to the next breath. Kindly, just bringing your kind attention back to the breath. And then very gently, I'm going to allow you to expand your field of awareness from the breath now to include sounds. So directing your attention to the soundscape around you. So we're not purposely trying to find a sound, we're just allowing sound to come into your field of awareness. Just noticing, what do you hear? Observing sounds close by, sounds in the distance. Just enjoying the soundscape. Again, if your mind has wandered, just noticing, maybe you notice it went to the future or rehashing something from the past, just noticing kindly, okay, come back to the sounds around me. Then gently allowing your field of awareness to expand again to include anything that's happening. So maybe noticing your breath, maybe noticing the sensations in your body, maybe still noticing the sounds Just allowing your field of awareness to include all these different changing experiences. Almost like clouds floating by in the sky. Just like, okay, sounds, breath, even thoughts coming and going. And again, if the mind wanders, you can just invite it to come back, maybe to the breath or maybe to the sounds. Just letting your field of awareness be open to the changing sensations coming and going. Everything is included. We're not pushing anything away now. Just do this for another moment or so. Now, just going to invite you very gently to return to the breath. Let's take 2 full breaths together again. So when you're ready, breathing in through the nose and out through the mouth. Breathing in through the nose and out through the mouth. I'm just coming back. So that's a little taste of open focused meditation. So we just simply notice what's happening, right? So we allow the environment to open up to you. So we use sounds, right? And just noticing sounds. We can use this with feelings, sensations, etc. Allowing ourselves just to take in whatever's happening in the present moment. So both open focused and focused meditation are effective, and one's not better than the other. So I like to sometimes start with focused awareness of breath and then move into open focus. So we're kind of getting the best of both worlds. Finally, I want to, this last part of the presentation, talk a little bit about mindfulness and stress. So Janina Fisher, who's a psychologist I've had the fortunate opportunity to study with a little bit, she talks about how mindfulness techniques can help calm the body, activate the frontal lobes, and help us change our behavior. So this goes back to that window of tolerance again. We know that mindfulness techniques can help us when we're really struggling. You know, when we're feeling well, it can be great to practice mindfulness meditation and to be able to take in what's happening in our awareness. But if we're feeling really stressed, it can be difficult to do that. So we can use somatic resources, that means body resources, or physical resources in the body, to help us feel more well and a sense of safety. So especially if we're in that hyper-aroused state, hyper or hypo-aroused state, it can help us come back to our basis, our homeostasis or window of tolerance. So mindfulness of the breath can be very helpful, but there are some other techniques I wanted to share as well. This is one of my favorites, and I include it in most of my daily practices, which is simple self-touch. So when we're feeling really stressed and we're not able to come back into the present moment easily, we can do a couple of body-based practices to help us come back into our window of tolerance. So self-supporting touch, and it doesn't have to be, but naturally we tend to want to put our hands on our heart. Touch can create a cascade of positive hormones. Stress, as we saw earlier, can create stress hormones, cortisol, that gets circulated throughout our body into our organs when we're in a fight, flight, or hyper-aroused state. Touch has the opposite effect. It can send us a cascade of positive hormones that can help us feel more relaxed and engaged. So hand on the heart, sometimes, and I've been working with some trauma experts who say even a hand on the forehead and a hand on the back of the neck can be very relaxing and soothing. So we can practice just even doing gentle self-touch when we're feeling really stressed. When I work with adolescents or kids, sometimes we do a little butterfly hug, right? We can hug ourselves. That also can give us a sense of safety and containment. So even if our minds are still really stressed, our bodies are responding to the supportive self-touch. So if anyone's ever used a weighted blanket, those are really popular nowadays. Or when you feel really secure, when you're under multiple comforters, right? That's kind of giving ourselves that containment, that sense of relaxation, even if we're feeling pretty upset or tense. We also can bring ourselves back to the present moment, doing some brief techniques like the stop technique, which means to stop, take a breath, observe the body's sensations, and think about, what do I need most in this moment? So it's kind of like a little mini timeout right before we hover to send a text or an email, right? It gives us this little moment to really come back into, hopefully, our attentional capacity, our three systems, to get them back online and to come back into our window of tolerance. Another recap. So somatic resources, body resources, can help us feel more safe and create a sense of well-being at a body level. And if our bodies are feeling safe, then our minds are less reactive. So our bodies play a big role in our nervous system response to stress. So anything that can help us somatically resource, which can be paying attention to our breath and body, or doing soothing touch and self-compassion, those techniques can help us to come back into the present moment. And then we have the capacity to use other coping skills. All right, so let's think about, how do we integrate mindfulness into our workday? We know that doing short practices can be very effective. So the number one thing I hear from lawyers and legal professionals is, I don't have time to meditate, right? So it is so important to do short practices, even if that's all you have time for each day is a couple of minutes, maybe even 60 seconds. But each time you do that, you're coming back into the present moment. Way in the beginning of the presentation, I talked about how our minds wander 47% of the time. So can you imagine if each day you did 10 mindful check-ins throughout the day? That percentage starts to change, right? So 47% of the time mind wandering starts to drop to maybe 42% of the time. And along with that, increases our capacity to be more present, to help our attention to do what it's supposed to do, right? Focus, alert, and have executive control. So 1 minute pauses, center before you enter, which means like when you're about to start something new, just to take a pause. They did this study with clinicians where they found that clinicians who did a 5-minute check-in centering before they saw clients had better outcomes. The clients had more improvements than when the clinicians didn't do that practice. And here's the interesting thing: the clients didn't know the clinician was practicing. So the clinician was more engaged, more capable of listening and taking in what the person was saying. And that really extends to anyone who's in the helping profession. We're more capable when we're mindful ourselves. Our attention span increases and we're able to listen more effectively. And I love bringing mindfulness to something we already do. So one of my mindfulness teachers teaches something called a sense and savor walk. Sense and savor. So, these beautiful spring days we're having, well, not lately, but hopefully the rest of the week, the idea of going outside and sensing through our senses, our sense doorways of our sight and smell and hearing and listening, we can really take in what's happening around us. It doesn't take long, right? We could be walking to our cars or walking to work, walking to our trains, but it can take a moment to come back into the present moment. And then we're in our kind of fully capacitated attention span. We can use apps. I'm a big fan of apps, whether it's on our phones or some of the apps here, just to help us get a little extra motivation. For many of us, we start the apps and we can kind of lose track, and that's okay. We can pick them up anytime. If we need a little inspiration. I use them sometimes when I need inspiration. A guided meditation can be really powerful. And if we don't have time, we just listen to our breath, right? We have a ready-made timer because our breath is always available, right? We breathe about 17 to 18,000 times a day. So we've got that little bell in us already if we need, right? All right, so this is us all after we've been practicing meditation. Our attention span increased, and and hopefully a feeling of well-being as well. So I'm going to stop here and see if we have any questions or comments from you all.
Tracy, this was marvelous. Thank you so much. As we had someone note in the chat, they were making a play on words in your slide about the brain, and the meditators were lightening up and put that they are enlightened, both for lit. And I will say too, your presentation to us was so enlightening. It was knowledgeable, it was soothing, it gave us a lot of great tips. It showed how mindfulness can really help us bring it back, whether we are very stressed, feeling we're shutting down, feeling that we need to calm down. A lot of wonderful, wonderful tips. Thank you so much. This was incredible. We also had a question. Someone asked, could you repeat the stop technique? This was
Oh
back.
yes, yes, and I'll write it in the chat too. Yes, so STOP is an acronym, and it stands for stop. The S stands for stop, and I like to think about it, and I'll often, when I teach it, ask people to stop what they're doing, right? And if you're standing, to take a seat, or if you're sitting, you might stand up. So you're just changing what you're doing for a moment. You're stopping the engagement of the activity, right? And then the T is to take a breath. And I often say to take 3 breaths. So we stop what we're doing, we take 1 to 3 breaths, and then we observe. And this is where mindfulness comes in. We just do a little observation. Maybe the observation is, I'm really activated right now, or I'm feeling really, upset in this moment. And then that helps us to really pause and, okay, what do I need in this moment? So before I proceed, which is the P, we take time in the O, that's the longest part, and just see, what do I need to do to respond skillfully? So stop can take 60 seconds. It can be a pretty quick process, but it can be really helpful when we're really activated. So that is the stop sign.
Great. Thank you so much for expanding on that, Tracy. We had someone wonder why we breathe in through the nose and out through the mouth, wondering if there might be science behind that.
Yes, there is. That's a great question. And a couple things to say about it. But when we breathe in through the nose, that helps to activate our relaxation system, the parasympathetic nervous system. So think about when you're really stressed, we mouth breathe, right? We can hyperventilate, right? And that's activating our fight or flight system. But when we breathe through the nose, we're activating our parasympathetic nervous system response. So breathing in through the nose can be very helpful. Now, I teach it both ways. I often, once people have taken a few integrated breaths in through the nose and sighing it out, because when we sigh it out, we lengthen the out breath, which also helps with the relaxation response. Once we do that a few rounds, then I'll have people see if they can just breathe in and out of the nose and keep us in that relaxation response mode. So the nose, breathing in and out of the nose, if you can. Now, sometimes if we're stuffed up or we have sinuses or allergies, we can't. And that you still get benefit, but it sends a signal to the nervous system. Oh, okay, we're chilled, we're relaxed if we're breathing in and out through the nose.
Wonderful. We had another question. Will we be emailed a link to a recording of this webinar? Yes. Once this recording is up, by the end of the week, perhaps by tomorrow. If you pre-registered, you will be emailed a recording. We'll ask to see if the Tracy's prior presentation on foundations of attention can be included as well. Maybe even include some links she's done to other mindfulness and self-compassion practices. So yes, you will receive a recording. It'll also be on our website under resources. We had a comment, it feels like apps can be a double-edged sword, that our phones can be such a source of distraction. So using our phones for mindfulness might spend more time on them, things in that they do from several apps for mindfulness. I agree with that. It's I think if you can try to limit and just use the mindfulness apps, or also on your phone, you could do things like gray zone, do not disturb, different things, but they can be distracting. Tracy, what do you think on that?
I agree, Steve. I appreciate that. I think, selective use, and our intention, like Laura's saying, to put do not disturb, to know, when I'm doing this, using this app, I'm using it for this purpose. And the second piece is I like it as an inspiration, because many times we get kind of bored with our own practice, or we need a kind voice to guide us. In some of the apps, I love Insight Timer, is one of my favorite because it has teachers that are world renowned and really have so much wisdom. And so I learn from them, so it can inspire me. And I think that inspiration is helpful. So I absolutely agree with you. We want to, sort of break away at times from a lot of technology, but it can enhance our practice when we need it.
Well, thank you. We have some comments in the chat. Oh, I so agree with these. Someone writes, Tracy, you are phenomenal. Great to see you again. Thanks for this great session. We appreciate your kind feedback. Allison and Jean notes, absolutely amazing seminar. Thank you, Tracy. I agree. Tracy, you are just marvelous at this. Thank you. Ingrid adds, thank you for the session. The recap pauses were great. Love and gratitude from Chile. Gracias. Oh, thank you. Worldwide audience. Jennifer adds, this was wonderful. Thank you so much. Julie notes, Tracy, many thanks for sharing your expertise and enthusiasm with all so skillfully. This presentation should be, oops, sorry, I'm getting so many new messages that I can't read them all. Should be compelling even for skeptical attorneys and hopefully inspire them to undertake tasks you've provided. Such gratitude for your generosity. Oh, so beautifully said. Meta includes, thank you for this, Tracy. It was wonderful. Agreed. Paul, we can all use more mindfulness and soothing behavior. Thank you for this presentation in such a soothing voice. Mirroring what Laura said earlier. Amber notes, thanks you from Gibraltar. Oh, thank you so much. We love your comments too and your feedback. This is wonderful. And I completely agree with all of you. Tracy is a treasure. She has so much knowledge and she delivers it so skillfully and in such a soothing and really compelling, wonderful manner that both teaches and guides us through the practice. Meta wonders, Tracy, do you do mindfulness or yoga on a regular basis? Tracy, do you want to share about that?
I do. Actually, through LCL, I do a weekly yoga class for busy lawyers. That's free. We have fun for 20 minutes every Thursday at 2:00. So you can feel free to sign up on our website and also watch it on demand. And I do myself, yeah. So to teach it, I need to practice it to really have authenticity. So I'm always working on different kinds of practices. Sometimes my practice fails and I can feel it. I'm more irritated. My husband will say, aren't you a meditation teacher? I'm like, oh yeah, yeah. So I, just like all of us, can struggle, but it is the backbone of my soothing practices. It is, it always helps me when I'm having a challenging time. So I do have regular practice. Yeah, thank you.
And that you also teach mindfulness and yoga too, in addition to practicing yourself, which I think is really neat. Oh, and we can also link out to your yoga practices when we do this. Paul writes another comment. Oh, thank you, Paul. LCL is amazing. We had a presentation by Heidi. That would be Heidi Alexander, who is Executive Director of the SJC Committee on Lawyer Wellbeing. Shout out to them too for well-being all week in our offices yesterday, and it was truly helpful and brings increasing awareness. Oh, I'm getting lost with all the messages here. Maybe Tracy, you can take over as I'm scrolling.
Yeah. So Ying was asking, do you have any advice about how to tackle and focus on tasks we don't want to do? Yeah. So, I mean, I think oftentimes that's when we can use our flashlight, to know that when we really, really focus our attention, even a brief period of time, like setting a timer for 10 minutes. So I often will tell lawyers who are struggling with focus on a difficult task, just set a timer. And so that to really use your attention capacity in the way it's designed, and then to take a break and come back versus getting distracted, getting pulled off the task. So it's like really enhancing and giving yourself the cleanest attention for a period of time. So I think that's one of the recommendations. And there's a lot more we could talk about as well. And we're going to continue to work on attention as part of our webinar series. So we'll have more techniques as well.
That is wonderful. We had a couple comments suggesting to maybe add a quick weekly meditation for an addition to LCL offerings. Great idea. We will definitely consider that. Tracy is so skilled with this. I think we've captured all of the comments and the questions. We've had so many come in that we really appreciate all your feedback. Someone notes too, they'd love to add this as a resource on a website.
Oh, the
Tracy,
yoga. Yeah.
would they be able just to share the link, share the recording of this on their website?
Sure. Yeah. And also for the yoga, I think they were looking for the link for the yoga too.
Okay,
Yeah.
wonderful.
She meant
Oh,
the, yeah.
yoga. Oh, yes, of course.
Yeah.
That would.
I'll pull it up now. Let's see if I can get it. So we can get that for you. Yes, I've got it right here.
Oh, and we have further comments seconding the idea for Week for Mindfulness. More comments of thanks and gratitude. So, and thank you for sharing that. Well, it is 1 o'clock. We want to respect everyone's time. Thank you so much for being with us
Thank
here. Tracy, we're delighted you're here. Attendees, thank you. We wish you happy well-being week in law.
you.
Tracy, final thoughts over to you.
Thank you all so much, and I am so excited to hear the interest in mindfulness, and we'll really appreciate taking in the many kind words you said. And also, yeah, we've talked about getting a weekly mindfulness class, which would be wonderful, a drop in similar to what we're doing with yoga. So we'll definitely talk more about that. So thank you for coming this week, and stay tuned for some more webinars over the next year with different aspects of attention. So look forward to connecting again.
Wonderful.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Laura.
Oh, of course, pleasure to be with you all today.
All right.